welcome to our next Author on the Hill book talk. I always enjoy these so much because not only do I learn an awful lot, it's great to hear the voices of the authors and get a better understanding of their work from their perspective. Today we have Assistant Professor Jorge Santos. No? No? You have not updated your CV. Your CV is an assistant and
that's on me. That's on me.
Well, since this morning, he has been promoted to associate professor. See, the news things come out. I read them. I'll grow.
Actually, he's just promoted to professor like 3 minutes ago.
Oh, well.
I can go then.
And congratulations on your retirement, American. Boy, life goes by.
Memorial browser.
Today, Professor Santos is going to be talking about his book, Graphic Memoirs of the Civil Rights Movement, which when I first read it, I said, reframing history in comics. I had to frame comics that it's actually comic books and not individuals telling jokes. So, Professor Santos is got his PhD at the University of Connecticut, although it's interesting because he got his bachelor's and master's down in Texas at Sam Houston State University and Texas Southern University, or Southern Texas? Texas Southern University.
Okay.
And now he is a professor of multi-ethnic literature of the United States, or in the United States. Of the United States. Close.
Both ends.
Close enough. So it's my pleasure to welcome and thank Professor Santos for presenting his book. So let's all give him a warm welcome.
Before I start asking people I want to thank, first of all, Laura Wilson for getting me arranged for this talk. Thank you very much for being super flexible about dates. I also need to thank Amit Khananjan for this killer tie that I bought from him in the summer and waited for today to wear. I also want to thank my colleagues in the English department for supporting me moving into comics. It's not what I said in my letter, but here I am. So thank you very much. And most importantly, I want to thank the students I see here, particularly those students from my Civil Rights and Visual Memory course that actually let me practice this in class yesterday, and then promptly gave me a list of revisions I needed. So thank you very much. So my book is Graphic Memories of the Civil Rights Movement. It came out with UT Austin in May. I was lucky enough to be awarded a choice selection, which if you don't know the choice award, it's a library award for the top 10% of academic titles in a given year. And I'll start my talk with a little bit, I guess, about the history of the project and where it came from, right? Because I did not go to grad school to become the comic book guy of the English department, right? In graduate school, I was focusing largely on conversion narratives and religious rhetoric in civil rights era novels and memoirs, right? So the civil rights movement has always been, to use an academic term, my jam from the beginning, right? In it, I discovered a graphic novel called Paulo's Inferno, which sought to reorient the way Chicano and Chicanx identities incorporate Azteca as a sort of counter to Catholicism, trying to find a way to live in the overlap without erasing the power dynamics of colonialism. And it happened to tell this story largely through visuals, and I got real fascinated with it, and it becoming one of my first publications. I wanted to include it in my dissertation, but my committee said no, it just doesn't fit. So it became sort of a side project, right? My fascination with graphic novels grew. I mean, to one extent, I've always been fascinated with graphic novels. I've been reading them since I was a kid, right? Classic immigrant father said, you can't read these are monsters and these are scary, which of course just made them cooler, which meant I read them all the time, right? But I never thought about them in an academic context. Comics lived here, my more scholarly pursuits lived there, right? But as what I found when I worked on my first piece on graphic narrative is that there was a tremendous amount of excitement, particularly in the multi-ethnic literature field, for projects like that. So I actually started going to conferences and presenting work, specifically at the MELIS conference, but also ALA and MLA. and showing my work with graphic narrative. And there I met a professor from Utah State named Christopher Gonzalez, and he told me that you should work on a book. And I said, no, because I just got out of grad school and I have to write my dissertation into a project. And he said, you shouldn't, and I said, too bad. The next year, he said it again, and this time he said, I want you to talk to Professor Aldama, who's working with UT Press, looking for graphic narrative focused projects. Let him try to talk you into it, and he did. And against every intelligent decision I could have made, I spent my junior leave working on a whole new project as opposed to revamping my dissertation. That project became Graphic Memories of the Civil Rights Movement. But one of the questions I get most often is why comics? Right? What is unique about comics, or why do I study art comics? What am I fascinated about comics, particularly in the context of the Civil Rights Movement? So the first thing you see on the left, that is Martin Luther King's The Montgomery Story. This was a comic book put out by the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the 50s. This comic, John Lewis credits in March, which you see here on the right.
Oh, we have it.
Huh? Do you have the Montgomery Story? Yeah, I have multiple copies of it. It is a two-part story. The first one is the biography of Martin Luther King, who becomes the icon of the Civil Rights Movement for many of us. And the second story is a sort of how-to manual, a sort of workshop guide for how to do activism, particularly how to be nonviolent, right? It's a sort of process-oriented thing, and this became widely distributed. And John Lewis, I said, credits that comic for getting him started, for giving him. Now he was, on board with civil rights before he read the comic, but the comic gave him the language and the idea of how to be an activist, right? So there's lots of shout-outs to that comic in it. So in terms of civil rights, there's built in, even when things say like the X-Men, which I'll talk briefly about in a moment, there's sort of relationship between the comic book and the civil rights movement for multiple reasons, right? The comic book has a history of being a marginal medium, and on those outer edges, it encountered marginal writers who were looking to tell their stories. Everybody from Jewish writers like Stanley and Jack Kirby to the LGBT writers of the 1980s comics of the Y or X, Victim or One You Prefer movement, and so on and so forth, right? So in a way, those two were, in my estimation, always destined to meet and to create an incredible amount of synergy at the end, at that crux. However, when it comes to the actual function of comics and the way they engage with history, I actually looked at Michel Foucault. So among the students here, has anybody ever heard of Michel Foucault? Oh, a couple, all right. Anybody plan to go to grad school? Maybe? Just shoot me and say yes. Thank you, Kevin. So when you get there, you can be like, oh yeah, Michel Foucault. Here's a quote. You can just be the coolest kid in school. So this is Michel Foucault. He's an important historian. That's all you need to know for this. He wrote in an essay called Of Other Spaces, he has the following quote. And I promise not to do this too much where I read a block of text to you, but this one is important. The present epoch will perhaps be, above all, the epoch of space. Now, before I start, I should say, he's working in a sort of very deconstructionist, post-structuralism mode, where it's more about revealing construction and sort of tearing down meta-narratives than it is about creating something new. But I still want to start here. The present epoch will perhaps be, above all, the epoch of space. We are in the epoch of simultaneity. We are in the epoch of juxtaposition. The epoch of the near and far, of the side-by-side, of the dispersed. We are in a moment, I believe, when our experience of the world is less that of a long life developing through time than that of a network that connects points and intersects with its own sky, right? The sky metaphor I particularly like because it's yarn, it's construction, it's weaving together, right? It's sort of history as a web as opposed to history as a theological line, right? When I see this, the first thing I thought of, like, this is what comics do, right? Famously, Scott McCloud in Understanding Comics says that time and space are the same force in a comic book, right? Time is represented by space on the page, right? This allows a lot of interesting narrative tricks that you can create. For example, it is, I would argue, the only medium where we can perceive the past, the present, and the future simultaneously, depending on how we read the page, right? For example, you can go move panel to panel, frame by frame, as is most common, or as Art Spiegelman has suggested, you should go page by page, and the one page is the individual unit of meaning. If the panel is the sentence, the page is the paragraph, and that's where Art Spiegelman says that we should live. Scott McCloud would disagree. He prefers to move panel to panel, but the fact that there are multiple registers of movement and multiple ways to depict time on the page allows space and time to become synonymous, right? And in here we see the side-by-side, the simultaneity, the juxtaposition, the fragmentation of history that Foucault is searching for, right? And in this sense, comics are particularly how can I say this, armed to enact this kind of ethos, because it already, as a narrative medium, works through fragmentation and through dispersal and through a network of meaning, as opposed to linearity or teleology implied by previous forms of history that Foucault is coming after, right? So I started thinking about how then do graphic narratives tell history, as well as what histories are they telling, right? Those become the sort of two operative questions. Particularly because, for those of you who know much about the civil rights movement, we, I promise I don't have too many of these. And this, I highlighted the only part you have to read in case you need it. So, the civil rights movement is perhaps the most documented, photographed, televised political moment in US history. Certainly the most iconic, right? So one of the questions I asked is, why would you draw when you have such an archive of quote-unquote real images you could draw from, right? And that brought me to this book. It's an excellent collection about how to engage in civil rights memory, and the concept particularly of consensus memory. And there are two sort of facets of this I'll point out. That'll be a much more complicated theory, but for the purposes of this talk, I'll streamline. The first is that we have a tacit understanding of what the civil rights movement is, where it was, what it was for, and what it did, right? Generally speaking, it starts in 1954 with Brown versus Bears Education, heightened by the death of Emmett Till, culminating in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Dispersed in there are some important speeches and some burning buses, right? Generally speaking, we all agree to this frame. This is the story that gets reified every year on Martin Luther King Day. It gets reified every day on street signs and memorials, right? There is a particular version of this history that we like. The comics that I'm going to talk to you about operate generally within these bounds, right? But more important about the idea that something is sort of generally or tacitly agreed upon is this quote. In the dialectic between remembering and forgetting, that is a central component of memory. Such narratives beg us to ask what is at stake in these dominant representations of the past. What kind of civil rights movement is produced through this consensus memory, and what vision of the present does it help to legitimate, valorize, or condemn? That last question becomes very important for my work. Why are we choosing to remember this? Why these interventions? And of course, why a comic? What can a comic book do that other things cannot? So, here's the book. It's broken down into what I like to think of as paired chapters, and I don't sort of break them up this way in the book, but I sort of conceptualize them like this myself, so I can sort of organize what I want to say about them. The first two chapters look at Ho Chi Anderson's very difficult biography of Martin Luther King. When I say difficult, it is deliberately obtuse. It has a bevy of art styles. It deliberately refuses to pick an aesthetic. It is making visual allusions to the work of Oliver Stone, to Harlem Renaissance painters, and it is very deliberately difficult. And I'll show you an example in a moment. And then chapter 2 is John Lewis, and I paired them with John Lewis's March, where he looks to sort of expand past the sort of great man history that gets adjoined to people like Martin Luther King by sort of giving a memoir of the movement itself. You might think of that as he's biographer of a moment, not a biographer of, say, a person or even himself. Long passages across the 3 volumes aren't even about him, right? So I posed those two together because they are the two perhaps most familiar figures now. Martin Luther King, of course, is the icon of the movement, and John Lewis is still with us and very politically active. I should also add that part 2 really tries to address the idea that Barack Obama's inauguration ushered in a post-racial moment, so it tries to walk the line between both admiring and elevating the sacrifices made by civil rights actors, but not participating in a discourse that suggests that their work is over, right? So here's an example from Ho Chi Anderson's. You can see just a bevy of different visual strategies. This is actually the I Have a Dream speech, right? It's the most recognizable moment here rendered unrecognizable, at least initially, right? I won't spend too much time on this because I want to get to the chapter 4, which will be the meat of my talk. I want to make sure there's time for questions. But essentially, there are 2 King traditions when it comes to biographies. There is the saintly, sanctified, what some people call the Santa version of MLK. Then there's a more salacious version of MLK, right? What Ho Chi Anderson tries to do, particularly through the visuals, and you can see examples in these 2 center panels that are overlapping, is not side so much with, say, the mythic king or the shadow king, but try to walk the line between them and make the point that any version of king we have is essentially a construction mediated through history and media, And the king is essentially unknowable, so his king becomes unknowable even visually. It is very much a sort of 90s ethos of deconstruction, right? Here we have a shot from the inauguration from John Lewis's march. If you see the overlaid panels, those are all moments from Bloody Sunday and the attacks on the Selma marchers, right? Suggesting that these histories overlap but also contradict or even disrupt one another. Suggesting that one has it into the other. In fact, very often, moments that are sort of depicted as glorious, like this inauguration song, are figured as moments to mourn the past as opposed to sort of predict the future. Okay, so the next two I look at sites and actors that fall outside consensus memory. So first I have Dark Room, a memoir written by an Argentinian immigrant who grew up in Alabama at the time of the movement. And her narrative is one of a black and white political moment that has no room for non-black or non-white actors, right? So as a Latina, she doesn't know where she fits, right? So she settles for telling her story, and she does it by recreating, reimagining, or simply inventing moments in the history of the movement as photographs that she recreates. So she becomes the documentarian of the movement, and is doing so to create the narrative space where she can inhabit, and in that sense becomes a sort of archivist as activist kind of character. I'll talk about chapter 4 at length. Here's a shot from Dark Room. Here's a shot from Silence of Our Friends. And the last one I focus on is the legacy of the civil rights movement. How did that discourse operate today? So the first chapter focuses on Stuck Rubber Baby. It's a 1994 semi-autobiographical memoir by Howard Cruz, growing up in the South as a closeted gay man who is participating in civil rights activism, ultimately finds inspiration in that and becomes motivated to embrace his own sexuality openly, right? In many ways, it is an example of a 90s discourse where people like Coretta Scott King and John Lewis were openly advocating for the LGBT movement to become the new civil rights movement, right? So it's very much enacting that energy. In doing so, however, he tends to reduce the civil rights movement to a series of recognizable tropes as he essentially moves the ethos and pathos of civil rights from its African-American activists to a largely white cast, right? And that in itself may be problematic, but perhaps authorized by culture, but the moment I really focus on is that the story ends with the lynching of a white activist, right? And the visual equation of the two. And the question I ask in the book is, how do we address something that, as a political project, many of us may be sympathetic, or I, for one, am on board. However, history belongs to certain people, perhaps, or perhaps it doesn't. So how do we then parse out that valuable resource, right? Particularly because, lynching victims have come from multiple, places and races and identities. It is still a history that largely frames the African American community. And particularly, I engage in conversations with African American literature about should you even depict lynching, right? And what does it mean to have a depiction of lynching here? I have a quick shot of it here. Remember, you can see it in the top left if you want to get a look at it. And finally, I look at the X-Men. So I write a personal essay. So I wanted to extend that sort of critical lens I did to Howard Cruz to myself, and what is the version of civil rights that I propagate in my classrooms, in my friends, in my conversations, and where did it come from? So I started with the X-Men, and I started with what I thought was an innocuous question on a comics listserv for other comic scholars is, for those of you who remember, we're there in a moment, how do you remember reading the X-Men in the 60s? And there was a huge divide. Like, the X-Men's not about the civil rights movement. It's about race broadly, but it's not about civil rights movement specifically. And other people are like, no, yes it is, right? By the 80s, that idea had been cemented. By the 80s, you start looking back and you see clear civil rights imagery entering the comics, right? And I sort of traced those, and I traced what kind of version of it. But more importantly, what I was interested in is what were the comics doing today, right? And I ended up uncovering a really interesting sort of history where the X-Men, and I say this sort of casually, predicted the Black Lives Matter movement and Ferguson. And when they realized that they had predicted it, and then now that they are sort of obligated to comment on it, the X-Men run away into the mountains and train for a year while everything, goes away, right? But it started, right, from this really interesting moment in the comics where, I don't know if you know the character, his name is Cyclops, he's the leader of the X-Men, kills Professor X in a fit of rage, right? because the X-Men are fighting the American government, Professor X sides with the American government, and Cyclops feels betrayed, and in a moment of rage, accidentally kills his mentor, right? Marvel Comics intended this to be read as a tragic thing, but fan culture got so involved with Cyclops that they demanded his freedom, right? And they actually freed the character, gave him this parallel team of X-Men that was more politically militant, and that's the group of X-Men you see here. They're leading protests, they are having confrontations with police, they're having obvious allegories to the problems of criminality in the country. Then Ferguson happens and they back the off, right? That story culminates with Cyclops gathering all the mutants on the Lincoln Memorial and giving the mutant version of the I Have a Dream speech, right? So bringing it back to the civil rights discourse. There's lots of ways to read that, right? You could read that as people don't have to fear the frustration or rage of people of communities of color, like it's okay, right? Or you could read it as a dovetailing back into respectability politics, which of course is very conservative, right? But what's interesting to me is that the fan culture demanded this version of the narrative. So comics, we can also see, particularly superhero comics, the way the community is co-writing these histories or involved in them. I mean, there's an amazing book by Rami Fawaz that sort of queers the archive of the superhero and just looking at the letters of what the fan demands are, what they want these characters to be doing and what they want to be saying and what they want them to represent. That idea, right? Scott McCloud calls closure in comics, that we participate in creation of the story, right? What I see here is that that extends beyond the page, and I want to sort of take those ideas and walk them through the reading I'm going to do here. So this is The Silence of Our Friends. This is chapter 4. The quote, you may recognize the longer version of it, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends, right? It's Martin Luther King, right? The subtitle, Civil Rights Struggle Was Never Black and White, signals clearly to the reader this is a civil rights story. The Martin Luther King quote even suggests it's a fairly, I don't want to say generic, but generic version of the story. It signals to you that this is going to be a familiar history in some way, right? Right down to the white man and the black man on the cover of the comic, right? But the first page of the comic is this. Houston, Texas, 1968, right? Which I find super interesting. First, not just because I'm from Houston, although that I'd be a part of it. So if you look back here, is the skyline of Houston. Here are the suburbs where the drama's going to play out. This is the first image, right? So as a civil rights narrative, three things stand out to me immediately. First of all, where it is, Houston, Texas, right? Not a place we would normally consider a civil rights problem, right? Not the Dixie South. When? 1968. Well past both the death of Martin Luther King and, the passing of the Voting Rights Act, which often is thought of as the end of the movement. And the narrative then focuses on, that's the next slide. No, not. Actually, I'm gonna linger on this image for a second. So this is about the third or fourth page. So before we get to this, as we zooming in, we see a young white child and a young female child playing in a backyard, right? This is in Sharpstown, a suburb of Houston, right? And they are playing a war game, right? The war game is, typical cops and robbers stuff, right? Except that the characters are the Marines and the Vietnam. So the first thing we get, the first two images we get completely destabilize the narrative, right? In the context of civil rights, right? Then they eventually go in here. This is going to be hard to see, but in the cathode ray tubes, which in the book I use Bakhtin to read, but I won't make you guys sit through reading Bakhtin, is the execution of Win Lem by General Lone live on television, right? It's the iconic pistol execution, right? And it's largely silent as they sort of are coming to terms with what they're seeing, right? What's really interesting about all these pages is the sort of simultaneous nearness and farness of the events, right? The television is bringing that into their living rooms, and yet the distance from them, signaled arguably by this first image, creates a sort of paradoxical relationship, right? I argue, exemplified by the muted reaction of the young boy, right? That young boy is Mark Long, the author of the story. The story will largely focus on his father, John Long, right? So John Long was a KRCC, which is a local news outlet in Houston, Texas. He was a reporter for The Bottoms, which was a name for the Fifth Ward ghetto in Houston, Texas. And his job is to cover racial topics, right? Typically at the behest of the station owner, but framed in the way that the editor wants it to be, right? Who is antagonistic to things like the civil rights movement, right? So you have implicit a relationship here between media apparatuses and how this narrative is going to unfold, right? It focused specifically on a story that happened in 1967. So in 1967, SNACE, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, opened a chapter in Texas Southern University, my alma mater, or one of them, and leading the administration to fire Professor Mac Jones, who invited them to campus, right? It was sort of an attempt to police what was perceived as black power militancy, right? This led to a sit-in, right, of about 100 students, right? The Houston Police Department responds to that sit-in with about 600 officers. When hostilities eventually break out, the officers, armed with AR-15s, empty about 5,000 rounds of ammunition into the dorms. Miraculously, nobody is killed, with the exception of Officer Lewis Cooper, right? The HPD eventually arrests 5 students responsible for his death. And he died from a single bullet, so I'll let you do the math there. I'll jump to the end of that specific story. The 5 are acquitted when it's realized that he died from friendly fire. Right? One of the AR-15 bullets hit him. Ricochet off a lamppost, I believe what they said happened. John Long was present and has footage that he believes might exonerate TSU 5, and struggles with revealing that because he's called to the stand because of what am I doing with his career. That becomes one of the central narratives here, right? Here are some images from the time. Now, this is shaped by the Long's family home and the relationship with Larry Thompson, the organizer and activist we saw on the cover, right? In the Long family home, they are, to use the parlance of our times, woke, right? They have black friends, they listen to black music, their kids play with black children. It is in many ways a nice little pocket of racial harmony, right? It's very much shaped that way, it's figured that way, right? They are in the heart of a very racist neighborhood that does not like the fact that they are doing this, right? So that idea, the sort of multiple spaces, the spaces in which history is enacted through the television, the history that is being playfully enacted in their backyard, the history that John Long is forced to participate in as a member of the media and as a witness on the stand for TSU, becomes the forces that sort of shape this. So I want to go back to partners, Foucault's epictetus. So this is an idea I drew out from the work of Pascal Lefebvre. It's actually much more complicated than this, but here I'm offering you a simplified version. And these are these 2 things: diegetic space, extra-diegetic space. Lefebvre defines the first one as essentially the fictive space inside the story, right? If you want to use sort of something colorful, Mordor, right? Gotham City, right? Fictive space is internal. The extra-diegetic space, of course, is everything that surrounds it, right? So I refashioned these to fit my project as this. Diegetic space is the narrative space controlled by the author, right? Fictive space, graphic novels, the Long's private home, where they are now creating and scripting, very deliberately scripting a sort of racial utopia, right? Sort of integrationist logic. And in memory, and I use in the sense of Pierre Nora as something active, pluralistic, multivalent, and more focused on the present than the past, right? Extra-diegetic space is where I start getting a little more custom. The narrative space where meaning is negotiated, right? So the space occupied by the reader, for comics this is important. Comics, as they are understood by comic scholarship, are in constant negotiation with the reader, right? There is the Long suburban neighborhood, which chastises them for having African Americans in their homes, although they don't use that word. KRCC news broadcast history as a teleological narrative, and then of course consensus memory. So I look at the way the Longs understand these spaces as distinct and bordered. It's okay that they don't participate actively as, in those spaces they don't control, because in the space that they do, right? So for the Long part of the narrative, that becomes enough, right? For everyone, right? But the case of the TSU-5 begins to disrupt the cleanliness of the way these spaces are imagined. So I have a few examples. So right before this scene I'm about to show you, here you see the testing of the Saturn V rocket. The young Long children, they have a cardboard box that they fashion into a television, right? And they like to play news, right? And in the safe space of their home, they script broadcasts of the news they wish the news would cover, specifically the things happening to their black friends, right? The news won't say about CC's getting hit by a beer bottle, so we'll do it in our home, okay? So in that space, they not only control the sort of racial relationships, but they also control the narrative of history that's going to go alongside those, right? This is playful, of course, right? There'll be multiple moments where we're asked to see John Long's reticence contrasted with the forcefulness of his children. So there is layers here. However, as soon as they go outside and play with their friends, they're chastised for this. Like, only you guys care about black people. They don't say that. They'll use a worse word, but that's essentially the argument. And here you see them dejected, watching almost confirmation of a news broadcast that is not covering the civil rights movement anymore, that has moved on to topics like the space race, communist containment, and the imperial war in Vietnam, right? So we see here, for the moment, a dejection of the fact that they have no control over the space they were just imagining. However, in their home, they're still safe. Until later in the narrative, when one of John's old army buddies comes to spend the night after a row with his wife and he's kicked out, right? They start playing their TV game and they start telling the story they did earlier. Cece was attacked on Wheeler Street and she has a bandage on her head, etc. At which point Bob interrupts and then says, like, no, stop. That's not what the news does. That's not what we're supposed to do. You're supposed to do this. And then he starts doing a racial pantomime of African Americans, right? At which point John finally kicks him out of the house, right? Here in this moment becomes a sort of, if you want to call, use language from like Bowman Vermont, there's a sort of consciousness rising here, right? Where he realizes the sanctity of these two spaces isn't going to happen. Visually, this disruption has been happening the whole time. As we see these floating television panels reminding you that, sure, you may see the world this way, the world does not see itself this way, right? And more importantly, America has moved on. Civil rights is done, right? And yet, paradoxically, not done, right? As we see the sort of side-by-side histories of one history moving at rocket speed, if we want to borrow a metaphor from the previous page, leaving behind the Longs and their concerns and the Thompson family, right? So what we see here, this moment makes them realize that the way they imagine these spaces as distinct, right, is ultimately a fantasy in of itself, in which this is the moment where John Long realizes, like, I have to testify, and I have to show the video, regardless of what happens in my career. It ends up being a very classic civil rights narrative. It is an uplift moment. The TSU 5 are acquitted, the tensions between the families is healed, and the neighborhood, which had stopped caring about civil rights anyway, stops caring that black people are coming over. It's very much a uplift narrative in that sense. But it comes from tracking these different spaces, these different narrative spaces, the way they interact, contradict, and intersect. So, one last panel, take some questions. The frame of Vietnam also kept coming up in other moments. Like, I kept just kind of abutting against Vietnam, right? As Vietnam does begin to dominate the national consciousness in the late 60s. So I have decided that my next project will be to move this to Vietnam. I want to add another layer to it. I want to borrow from Jared Gardner's excellent book, Projections. If you haven't read it, it's great. Discussing the cross-pollination between visual film language and comic books, right? How they sort of cross-pollinate. Particularly, not just in terms of visuals, but also in terms of genres, right? So here's some examples of stuff I started reading. On the right is an 80s comic from Marvel Comics called The Noms. It's a very almost classically postmodern, soldierist figure of tragedy kind of story, right? It's a very, very familiar Vietnam narrative if you follow those such things, like you see Platoon, for example. You may not recognize this, but the visual coding comes from Watchmen, right? So I want to read those in context of each other. Here we have The Best We Could Do, Thief We, as refugee narratives are more and more taking the graphic narrative form. Thief We, probably the best one known, but Beat in America, if you haven't read it, also excellent. And this one I just discovered like a week ago. I haven't read it, I don't know if it's good, but I saw the cover and I had to have it. And it's a werewolf story placed in Vietnam. And the potential for metaphors and also for haphazard storytelling are too enticing to turn it down. I don't know if I'm going to include this one. These two are definitely going to be in it. Again, I haven't read this yet. It might be terrible, but I'm very excited to find out. That's it. Thank you. questions? Comments? Praise?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. Really interesting, and now I can't wait to read your book. I'm curious about the piece you spent the most time on. The subtitle was something like "History is Never Black and White," something like that.
The civil rights struggle was never black and white.
Right, and then we have this super high contrast black and white graphic novel, and I wondered if you want to speak to that a little bit, because there seems like there's an opportunity to think about sort of the visual language of it beyond the diegetic and extra diegetic, but in terms of color.
Right. I actually really do that a lot with the previous chapter of Darkroom, because it's all pencil shading, it's all sketch, and she openly says, I'm trying to introduce a sliver of gray into a black and white narrative, right? So the aesthetics sort of signal that, constantly signaling that, right? I would say though, the cathode ray tube that I do make this point in the book are sketches. The pencil sketches that sort of stand against the kind of high contrast of the other color. So that's sort of like never black and white. Well, honestly, a bit of a sort of like, a metaphor that doesn't get as much play as it could, right? Does mostly exist in these TVs, right? Which I read as a sort of sketching of history in the moment, right? And they're sort of witnessing not only this creation of history in front of them, but their exclusion from it, right? So that's, in this one, that's the only sort of black and white metaphors you see very often. But Darkroom, which loves photography metaphors, is always using sort of black, white, and grays as sort of visual metaphors. So I don't know if that's the best answer. This doesn't deliver on that promise, truth be told.
Thanks.
Yes?
I love this big, beautiful presentation. Like,
Thank you.
I took your class last semester, and I also like grew up like fascination in comic books in terms of like activism and like looking at narratives. But I thought it was interesting that you mentioned today, well, like also like in class as well, but today that comic books are a way of looking at like how to do activism. And I was wondering, since a lot of movements happen like in college, how does comics access activism like outside of like academia during the time of like the civil rights movement, or like prior to that? Because I'm just like speaking from personal experience, and I know a lot of activists or people who are involved in politics who aren't necessarily like in the college realm, like how they can also like access comics as well, if not used like for like propaganda or like just learning purposes. Yeah, so the question is like, how does activism access comics, and or like vice versa? I don't know, like the question is around like access.
The answer is long-winded and random. So first of all, because of the comic's existence on the margins, there's always been an activist impulse, whether it's deliberately pedagogical, like the 4 comic, whether it's more allegorical, like say Ernest Stan Lee. Because of its presence on the outside, particularly its publication history, people tend to forget that one of the first victims of McCarthyism was comic book, right? Frederick Wortham's infamous book chastising the queerness of the superhero and the violence of the superhero as generating juvenile crime, right? Comic books are like the first video game, right? It's creating all these problems, right? They were heavily censored, right, by the U.S. government, to the point where they were brought, like multiple creators were brought forward to testify to Congress about what their comic book doing, right? And while I would stop short of calling them sort of like damaging subversion that they were figured as, there was something there. Superman's original story is an immigrant narrative, right? He is an immigrant, it's an immigrant narrative written by immigrants for immigrants, right? And the people he's fighting for until McCarthyism happens are people at the bottom of society, right? His villains are all corrupt politicians, landlords, insurance fraud. Like it's not, there's a whole story about insurance fraud. It's like issue 3, right? Sometimes what's fun about comics, bracketed multiple quotation marks, is how they're sort of cultural artifacts too. So there's an episode where Superman is chasing a landlord who's trying to commit insurance fraud, right? So the person, his goon, if we want to use sort of Nora language, goes one way, the landlord goes the other. Superman's running with a police officer. Superman's like, oh, which way do we go? And the police officer, this is a true story, says, I got this, shoots the guy in the back. Superman goes, good job, and goes against the other guy. That's super legal now, right? So, but that impulse has always been there, right? These are marginal writers writing for marginal communities, right? Stan Lee coded a lot of his, if you want to call it activism, it's probably social commentary might be a better phrase, through allegory, right? Or through genre, right? The Hulk expresses concerns about atomic warfare. Spider-Man is ultimately a allegory for puberty, the X-Men, civil rights, right? So that history has been there since the beginning, right? I think that the comics are the most interesting when they sort of take advantage of that sort of meta-critical level they can function on. Now, there's plenty of comics that don't bother, right? They're just straightforward stories, but the ones that sort of ask us, don't tell us how to do activism, but how to think about activism, are the ones that I find the most interesting.
I have a question about, kind of continuing with this, about what you were saying about comics being almost co-authored by the fans and the public. And I was wondering if there's any sort of, you mentioned like a database or something like of fan letters, and is there any resource to see like kind of what happens at what time and what people are asking and saying about, and is that all just, is that ever published?
So there's a couple,
Okay.
right? So the first one I would say is Marvel Comics Unlimited has all their back issues on a Netflix type subscription where you can go back and look at them. And you can sort of look up dates. I legitimately was looking at publication dates and lining them up with Ferguson. Like, how are these, what's happening in these moments, right? I think that there is right now, I actually sit on the board of the Graphic Narrative Database that's trying to create a kind of something like the DTA here for comic books, right? I don't know if anybody here has taken my graphic narrative seminar, but in that seminar, every student writes an entry, right? They want that one to be very student-driven, very fan-driven, but it's for academics. And then the third one, and you're going to hate this, is the library.
Hate this?
Hey, look, I don't hate it. I love the library. I got my own room in the library. That's someone else's name on it, that's okay. John, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about counter-narratives, right, and the memories of the civil rights movement that are kind of, I don't know, whites, for lack of a better term, white supremacist redactions of history, and the kind of propagandist pieces that those are put to. Is there a kind of, I mean, one would presume that a lot of these are being kind of folded into more mainstream. I mean, I would think this is probably like being sold to Hollywood as we speak, or something. It seems like Oscar-worthy, ready to be sold to Middle America. Absolutely. And so forth, right? But is there a sort of, I don't want to say insurgency, but is there a tradition of kind of ongoing racist redactions of these kinds of moments?
Darkroom is actually all about that, right? Darkroom is
That's
essentially, that's the narrative, right? That we have to go back. I actually in the book say I don't call these counter-histories because counter-histories are antagonistic, particularly the consequences of memory. These are more supplemental or expansive, right? It's more of a restorative logic to them than a counter. I would say the exception would be perhaps King. I know some of my friends, my students here have read King. That one is a counter-history in that it's countering history. Like, it's just against history as a project, right?
Right.
It's not offering you an alternative, right? You're typically not alternative. The thing about consensus memory is it has such cachet. And most of them want to try to accommodate for that cachet without being completely allegiant to its frame. So there's like a tension there. Some have more of a sort of we could call it an oppositional stance. Actually, Santos and Friends has quite a bit of that logic to it. But it also ends with the death of Martin Luther King. So it wants to be more included in that narrative than it wants to be countering that narrative. This is also, and I sort of put this is like, I read about 20 civil rights-oriented graphic novels that came out in about 15 years. There's just like a mini genre that's emerging. And like most genres, if I were to say this is its first wave, we're not at the place where you see counters to the genre yet. That energy does manifest in particular moments, but I would not go as far as to call them counter histories. There's just too much. John Lewis is a great example. There's just too much to want to build on these sort of inherent pathos of the civil rights movement, as opposed to just rejecting it. In fact, even H.C. Andersen, his original ending to the comic was this moment in the 90s of police brutality that sort of suggests it was all for nothing, right? In the special edition that came out at the 25-year anniversary of the comic, he rewrote it because he said that's too dark, like that disrespects the legacy of Dr. King. So there's always this dovetailing back into the elements of consensus that they want to use. You may argue it's more piecemeal, like they're taking the parts they like and they're leaving behind the don't, or inserting what they think needs to be there, but I wouldn't go so far as to say they're opposing the historical project of civil rights movement, so much as participating in it in a very focal way and inviting our participation. But there were times where I thought, like, this could be more daring, like this, you could push here further, right? But I don't think that if I'm right and this is becoming like a mini comics genre, it's just not there yet.
So I was struck by, this is great by the way, I was struck by your comment about X-Men being about Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, and then when the moment actually happens, they run away. And my first thought was, well, of course, because this is shaped by capitalism in that it's hard to, in the moment, if you're selling to a primarily white audience, or an audience doesn't even necessarily have to be white, but one that has bought the sanitized scrub version of a civil rights movement, that they're going to run away because that's going to impact sales, right?
So that's fear, for sure.
Fear, right. So I wonder if you take up the topic of capitalism in shaping memory as written through the graphic novel.
I touch on that particularly in the King document, in the King section, because King is his economic radical politics is often written out. Nobody likes that element of it, right? So through King I sort of discuss it. With the X-Men I don't, because I'm really focused on myself, and particularly because the X-Men now, like, I do think that there's definitely that fear, this is going to hurt sales, right? But the outcry of the fandom proved that wrong almost instantly. They walk that back immediately and give us a militant version of the X-Men. And for those, I don't know if anybody's reading today, that militant version of the X-Men has taken over the comics. The X-Men are militant. They're actually separatists. They've abandoned America in the comic. So they've actually embraced it, ironically, because it sells.
Interesting. Good. Thank you.
I mean, there was a Cyclops is right meme. The one to talk about supreme levels of perhaps unintended irony, which just makes it look like shade water. But it's a meme, so it's circulated for free, right?
Yeah.
I actually tried to buy a T-shirt of it, and I just couldn't find one. I wanted to anyway. I saw it hanging, and then look, Mark.
This question is a little like Jonathan's question. I'm thinking of the function of these narratives in representing history in a culture where often, like, you might know what happened in the news because you watched it on Saturday Night Live. So I'm wondering, like, what is the tension between representing history and interpreting it in the sense that I'm assuming that the audience may not necessarily know, may not recognize some of the images that are being put into a new context.
Well,
So-
I actually think the comics tend to assume you have familiarity with them. That's usually a baseline. I think in terms of the sort of representing history, I think this is a good example. You see versions of this in King and Darkroom and Stuff Rubber Baby, pointing out how history is received, and that becomes its sort of critical intervention, right? Not treating history holistically or passively, right? Receiving it as construction. Darkroom activates that energy, and I sort of borrow from performance studies, both in that chapter and from chapter 4. Comics, as a field, likes to call itself anti-disciplinary, right? Like buffet style. I don't try to go that outside the lines with it, but I do try to borrow from places that I think are useful. And the way that this is, like, to go back to your question about activist memoirs, I use Jacques Rancière's Emancipation of the Spectre to talk about how this is trying to emancipate the reader from the passive relationship to history and become an agent in the process. So it's less about history itself as it is our relationship to history, particularly as it is mediated through particular mediums and forms.
I just asked a quick follow-up question. So are things like photographs and TV images has drawn in the comics, is there a sense that they are sort of more passive, maybe less dynamic than the comic itself as a representation?
I think so. Particularly, I borrow a lot from Susan Sontag to make that point. As I jokingly say with my students, our relationship to the photograph is Pixar didn't happen, right? Our relationship to the comic is, this is the construction, I know this is art, it's art teaching the history, so you don't lose sight of the historical narrative as a construction. And in the hands of an auteur, it's signaling, hey, mine is also constructed, don't have that relationship with this book either, right? As it's constantly trying to sort of activate the reader. So it's more of, like I said, again, understanding history as a project, as opposed to history as just passive information.
I think we got time for one last question.
I have a question. So thank you so much for the talk. What I love about your work is that you're basically teaching us how to read comics as you're yourself reading these comics, and I think that's such a kind of remarkable and valuable thing to add to our conversations around literature and around how we engage with text and make meaning. It's something that I try to do in my work as well. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to how does one learn to read in this way? And does it just mean, you were immersed in comics from a young age? And why do you think we should be reading these different, maybe like marginal forms of storytelling?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, to sort of the reading comics, right? But again, I explain to my students, one of my go-to moves in the class, particularly when I start any unit, this applies to all literature, is how is this book asking us to read it? How is this book teaching you to read itself, right? I think comics in particular, because there's now, particularly in this moment, where they've become such a commodity, right? Is that there's such experimentation with form that you don't have to relearn it per comic, and that's what I try to embrace, right? What's really interesting is the dichotomy between people who grew up reading comics, right? And for me, where sometimes I'm like, I just read the comic. I don't know how I'm pausing at every panel and thinking about its metaphorical resonances or its commentary on history. Like, I'm just reading the story. But my students who've never read comics are doing exactly that. Like, I don't know how to read this, and I'm going so slow, and they're seeing details I don't see because of my familiarity with the form. That distinction has been super useful in class because everybody sees something different. I'm very lucky in the moment where that is true, right? If I have my say, everyone's going to be reading comics, and at that point we're going to lose that sort of sense of discovery where you discover it for the first time in the classroom, right? And sorry, I forgot, the second half of your question was?
It was something like, how and why should we learn to read more marginalized forms of literature, we could say?
Wow, okay, well, honestly, because there's just undiscovered treasure there. That's the real answer, right? There's just gold. There's gold in the hills, right? That's why. I know that's a sort of idealistic answer. My students will tell you at the end of the day, I'm a book nerd. Like, as much as I love talking about activism, race, history, at the end of the day, I want a good story and I want to share it with students. So that's why. It's just, and the energy's there, right? This discarded medium plus these people that feel discarded. There's a certain ethos there, but there's some creative energy that happens there too. There's just exciting things happening there, just like there is in any ignorant scene, whether that's film, comics, poetry. I think that those spaces where we don't look, there's just undiscovered treasure there that we can bring back to the canon and put into conversation, right? For example, I don't believe you can really appreciate Junot Diaz if you haven't read the story from the Fantastic Four that opens the story, right? He has said that the Hernandez brothers taught him how to write. Those are underground Latinx comic writers, right? John Lewis said March would not exist without the Fellowship for Reconciliation. Now, that comic isn't particularly artful, but there's that possibility for cross-pollination, right? These don't have to be parallels or counters, right? I will say I share that ethos with these, is that expanding these archives and expanding these canons should be our approach, not supplementing, not replacing one with the other or putting them in unnecessary hierarchies. I think the possibility for cross-pollination, that's what my students say, there's a graphic novel in every one of my classes, right? And it helps us see I think it actually helps you see what traditional forms of fiction or prose can do that the comic can't, and vice versa. So you also get a better appreciation of the genres and the mediums when you do that.
Was this not great? So a couple last last minute items, we do have refreshments in the back if you want to grab a tea or a cookie or something else like that. There is a form at your seat if you don't mind filling that out, giving us a little feedback as well. We did videotape this, so if there was something you missed, it'll be posted under our Authors on the Hill YouTube channel. So yes, we'll make sure that you get lots of views. We are working on the fall's Author on the Hill book talk. If you have recommendations, we're always welcome to hear those, but hopefully we will see all of you back, unless you're a senior, in which case hopefully you're graduated by then, but you're welcome to come back anyway. So thank you all. I very much appreciate you coming out and listening, and let's thank Professor Santos. And I also encourage you to go up to our graphics novels collection on the first floor, which is a great collection.
Yes. Yes, amazing.